The first time Marin saw the alien girl, she was standing behind the dumpsters on the east side of Whitmore Station's Level 3 food court, watching a rat. Not chasing it, not afraid of it, just watching. She was thin in a way that stopped being interesting after a few seconds, and started being upsetting, the kind of thin where you could see the movement of tendons in her forearms when she shifted her weight. Her skin was the pale violet gray of deep-water bioluminescence, her four eyes arranged in two stacked pairs down the center line of her face, the upper two large and forward-facing like a human's, the lower two smaller, angled slightly outward, always moving. Her head was smooth where hair would have been. She wore a surplus thermal jacket 3 sizes too big, cinched at the waist with a length of wire, and she was looking at that rat with the focused, patient attention of something that had run out of better options. The rat disappeared into a ventilation gap. The girl stood still for another moment, then crouched and picked up something from the ground near the dumpster. A crust of bread, stiff with age, probably fallen from the loading area above. She turned it over, examined it, put it in her jacket pocket with the careful economy of motion that meant it was not going in her pocket because she had somewhere better to put it later. It was going in her pocket because that was dinner. Marin stood in the mouth of the service corridor with her crate of supplies and watched this, and something moved through her chest that she didn't have a clean name for. She'd been running supply drops to Whitmore for 3 years. She knew the station the way you know a place you spend 6 days a week inside. Not with love, exactly, but with the specific intimacy of someone who knows which vending units were broken on Level 2, which security terminals had dead zones in their sweep patterns, which food vendors shut down at what time, and what they did with the leftovers. She also knew, in the way that you know things you have decided not to think too hard about, that there were a handful of alien migrants living in the maintenance sublevels below the public floors. The station administrators knew too and had decided, in their efficient bureaucratic way, not to know. It was easier. The Compact Worlds Act technically entitled any registered non-human sapient to access to station services, food vendors, medical, transit, but registration required documentation, and documentation required the kind of governmental machinery that had collapsed on Veth IV in the first wave of the recessionary conflicts, and the people who'd run from Veth IV hadn't had time to grab paperwork. They'd had time to grab their children and run. The girl pocketed her bread crust and walked away without hurrying. Marin watched her go and then looked at her crate, which contained, among other things, 11 prepackaged food pouches that were technically overstock. She was supposed to return to the depot distribution center. She looked at the space where the girl had been. Then she looked at the pouches. She had a hard rule about not making problems she couldn't solve. She'd held to it for years. It had kept her functioning and solvent and out of situations that ended badly, and she had, over that same stretch of years, gotten very good at ignoring the fact that she'd built the rules specifically to wall off things that hurt to look at. She put one pouch on top of the dumpster where the girl had been standing, stepped back into the service corridor, and started moving. She told herself it was a one-time thing. It was not a one-time thing. The second time she saw the girl, 3 days later, she was watching a different kind of spectacle. The Level 3 food court at midday was loud and warm, full of station workers and transit passengers, and the particular mix of species that Whitmore served, mostly human, with a scattering of Gel business people, a table of broad-shouldered Keth military transit who were drinking something dark and not speaking to anyone. Normal. Ordinary. The alien girl had made the mistake of coming up to the public level. She was standing at the edge of the food court, just at the transition from the public concourse, and she was simply standing there, not approaching any vendor, not sitting anywhere watching the food with the specific, desperate focus of a thing that has been hungry long enough that hunger stops being a feeling and becomes a kind of orientation, a way of existing in space. Marin saw the moment she was noticed. It moved through the food court like a ripple in still water. One human man, heavyset, transit worker by the look of his badge, saw the girl and made a sound, a short, contemptuous noise, the kind designed to be heard without being attributed. The woman next to him laughed. A Gel businessman leaned over to his companion and said something in his own language, and they both looked at the girl, and one of them made the gesture that translated roughly as other people's problem. A vendor at the nearest stall, noodles, hot, the smell of them filling 20 meters of air, saw the girl's gaze and very deliberately turned his back. None of it was dramatic. None of it was loud. It was just the low-level, constant, entirely normal humiliation of being visibly alien and visibly hungry in a public space, and the girl took it with the stillness of someone who had learned that any other response made things worse. Marin was carrying her crate. She had deliveries to finish. She had a schedule. She crossed the food court in 12 steps, set her crate down on the nearest empty table, walked up to the noodle stall and said, "2 portions." The vendor turned around. He was a compact man with a narrow face and the flat eyes of someone who had learned to move through his days without friction. He looked at Marin. He looked at where the alien girl was standing. He looked back at Marin. "For yourself. For me and my friend." There was a pause. The vendor looked like he was considering several things, and Marin watched him consider them, and she kept her face pleasant and her posture relaxed, and she did not look away. He took her payment card. She bought 2 portions. She walked back to where the alien girl was standing and held out one of the containers. The girl looked at it. Looked at Marin. Her lower eyes, the small, angled ones, were doing something complicated, moving in a pattern Marin didn't have the context to read, but her upper eyes were very still. "Come eat with me," Marin said. 4 small words. She said them quietly, without drama, because this was not a dramatic situation. This was a person and a container of noodles and a table. The girl took the container. They sat at the table next to Marin's crate and ate noodles in the loud, warm middle of Whitmore Station Level 3, and the food court moved around them, and nobody said anything, because when you are simply sitting and eating, it turns out that you are slightly harder to humiliate. The girl ate quickly at first, the speed of someone who had learned not to trust the continued presence of food, and then, when she seemed to register that Marin was not going to take it back, she slowed down, ate the rest with something closer to attention. When she finished, she sat for a moment with the empty container in her hands, all 4 eyes on the table. "Thank you," she said. Her standard was accented but clear, the syntax slightly formal in the way of someone who had learned it from recorded sources rather than conversation. "I'm Marin." The girl considered this for a moment. "Steve." "How long have you been on the station, Steve?" Another pause. 11 months. Marin had been on the station for 3 years and ate at the food court 4 times a week. She tried to do the math on 11 months of eating what fell near dumpsters and couldn't hold all of it in her mind at once. "Do you have family here?" "My father." A fractional pause. "He works in the maintenance levels, venting repair. They do not pay him, but they allow him to stay." She said it without bitterness, just flat, careful accuracy, like she'd had to explain it before and had learned to strip out the parts that made the explanation uncomfortable for the person hearing it. "And you?" "I help him when I can." The lower eyes moved. "There is not food for both of us often." Marin thought about the bread crust in the jacket pocket. "About 11 months. "Come find me at the East Service entrance on Tuesdays and Fridays," she said. "Level 3, 7 in the morning. I'll have extra." Steve looked at her. The upper eyes were still very steady. "Why?" It was a genuine question, not a suspicious one. Or it was both, maybe. The kind of question you ask when you've been hungry long enough that generosity stops making intuitive sense. Marin thought about it honestly. "Because you shouldn't have to eat bread from the ground," she said. "That's all." She found out about the father gradually, in pieces, over the following weeks. His name was Dove. She learned that from Steve on the third Tuesday, when the girl mentioned him while telling a story about a repair malfunction that had flooded Sublevel 4 with recycled coolant. The story was told with a dry, precise humor that surprised Marin, and she laughed, and Steve went very still for a moment in the way of someone who had not expected the laugh to be genuine, and then the stiffness went out of her shoulders and she laughed too. She learned that Dove had been a structural engineer on Veth IV, not a maintenance worker, not a vent technician, an architect of sealed environments, the kind of person who designed the systems that kept large structures livable. She learned this because Steve mentioned offhand that he'd figured out why the coolant malfunction had happened and had fixed it in a way the station's own engineering team had not been able to. And when Marin asked how he'd known, Steve said, simply, he built things like this. What she didn't learn until the Tuesday when Steve came to the service entrance with a cut above her left upper eye, dried and cleaned but clearly recent, was the fuller shape of their situation. She didn't ask about it directly. She'd learned that directness landed badly sometimes, that Steve processed things in her own time and resented being pushed toward disclosures she wasn't ready for. She handed over the supply parcel and waited. Steve said, "There are men on Sublevel 6. "What kind of men?" "The kind who know that we have no documentation, who know that if we report anything, we are the ones who get processed." She said it quietly with the measured flatness of someone who has thought about this very carefully and arrived at a conclusion she doesn't like but has accepted. "They take things, money if anyone has it, whatever people are carrying. Sometimes they—" She stopped, touched the cut with the back of her hand, a gesture that looked habitual. "My father and I are careful. But 3 nights ago, there were more of them than usual." Marin was quiet for a moment. The corridor was empty. Somewhere in the building infrastructure, a ventilation system cycled. "How old are you?" she asked. 14 in my calendar, 16 in yours." 16 years old. Living in a maintenance sublevel with no documentation, no recourse, and men on Sublevel 6 who knew exactly how unprotected she was. "Your father," Marin said carefully, "does he know you come up here?" "Yes." A pause. "He doesn't come himself. He says we should not both be visible at the same time, in case." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Marin thought about the engineering schematics she'd seen in the station administration files when she'd been doing a supply delivery to the facility's office. She had access to parts of the building infrastructure as a licensed supply contractor, access that was mundane and unremarkable, and that she had never previously thought to use for anything except her job. She thought about what a structural engineer who had built sealed environments on Veth IV might be able to do with a different set of maintenance corridors, a different configuration. "I'm going to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to think about it before you answer, and I want you to be honest with me about whether it's something your father would agree to." Steve was watching her with all 4 eyes. "All right. There's a different part of the sublevels, below the freight depots. It's not used right now. There was a storage expansion project that got canceled, and the access tunnels are still down there, and the space is on the documentation as decommissioned. Nobody goes down there except for quarterly inspections, and I know when those are." She paused. It's not a solution. It's not somewhere you should have to live, but it's not Sublevel 6. There's no one down there." Steve was quiet for a long moment. "You have access to this?" "I have access to the schematics. I'd need someone who knows how to read them and how to make the space survivable." She met the girl's eyes. "I know someone who used to build things like this." She met Duff 10 days later in the service corridor at 5 in the morning, an hour before any supply run started, in the gray-blue pre-shift light when the corridor cameras were on their lowest sensitivity cycle. He was tall and hollow-cheeked, carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had been running on insufficient sleep and food for long enough that the body had stopped registering it as crisis and had simply reclassified it as normal. His 4 eyes, the same stacked arrangement as Sieve's, were steady and watchful in the way of a person who had learned not to show what they were feeling in public. He looked at Marin for a long time, then he looked at Sieve, then he looked at the schematic printout Marin was holding. "You said she has supply access," he said to Sieve in Standard. "Yes. And she wants nothing in return." Marin answered that one herself. "I want you out of sub-level 6. He considered her. Why? She thought about giving him the same answer she'd given Sieve, because you shouldn't have to live that way, and decided he'd been on this station 11 months and knew exactly what humans said versus what they meant, and deserved more than the comfortable version. "Because your daughter comes up here every week with a cut on her face or a bruise somewhere," she said. "And she doesn't talk about it except sideways, because she's been taking care of you both and she doesn't want to add to it. And because you built sealed environments on Veth IV and you're spending your time fixing coolant vents on sub-level 4 and that's," she stopped. "It's wrong. In a simple way, I can help with the part I can reach." He was still watching her, then he looked down at the schematic. "There's a junction point here," he said and pointed, and his voice had shifted fractionally, not warmer exactly but more present. The voice of someone who was looking at a problem. "If the freight elevator bypass is still intact, there's a separate airflow system, independent of the main circulation. We could make it work without pulling from the monitored grid." "Can you tell by looking?" "I need to see it." "Tuesday morning, 5 a.m. I'll take you down." He nodded once. The economy of it reminded her of Sieve. She wondered which of them had learned it from the other. The space below the freight depots was low-ceilinged and cold and smelled of insulation foam and metal, and Duff walked through it in silence, running his hands along junctions and wall panels with the focus of someone reading a language that most people couldn't see. Sieve walked beside him, and Marin walked behind them both, and she watched the way their heads moved together sometimes, leaning close without touching, sharing observations in a language that switched between Standard and something else that moved lower in the frequency range than Standard did, something Marin couldn't hear completely, a subsonic register that made her teeth hum faintly when they used it. It took 2 hours. At the end of it, Dove crouched in the center of what had been a canceled storage annex and said, 6 weeks, maybe 8, with the right materials. "I can get materials," Marin said. "I'm a supply contractor. Most of what you'd need is in the category of general station maintenance stock. I can reroute supply deliveries." He looked at her steadily. "That's a significant risk for you." "Yes." "Why are you willing to take it?" She'd been thinking about the answer to that question since the first Tuesday at the service entrance. She still didn't have a clean version, so she gave him the honest one, the one that didn't resolve into anything tidy. "I've been walking past things for a long time," she said. "I've been very good at it. I've built a lot of rules about what I can and can't fix, and I've lived inside those rules very comfortably, and I've passed your daughter at dumpsters twice a week for months before I said anything." She paused. "I don't want to be that person anymore. That's probably not a good enough reason." Dove was quiet for a moment. "It's better than most," he said. 6 weeks turned into 5. Dove worked with the efficiency of someone who had built sealed environments under difficult conditions before, and understood the fundamental principle that you built not what you wished you had, but what the materials in front of you would allow. Marin watched him work sometimes, when she could, and was struck by the same thing over and over. The way he treated the space not as a problem to be endured but as a project. The way his whole bearing changed when he was building something. Sieve helped. She was precise and fast, and had clearly been watching her father work her whole life. She anticipated what he needed 2 or 3 steps ahead, and they moved through the space together with the wordless efficiency of people who have survived difficult things in close proximity. Marin brought food on Tuesdays and Fridays, and on Thursdays when she could manage it, and she ate with them sometimes, not always, because Dove still had the wariness of someone who didn't fully trust the situation, and she didn't want to push but sometimes. Steve told stories during those meals. Stories about Veth IV, about the city they'd lived in, about the market near their house that had sold a kind of preserved fruit that had no equivalent in standard. She told them with the careful precision of someone performing the act of preservation, keeping something intact through the act of describing it, the way you might cup water in your hands not because you have somewhere better to put it, but because letting go of it feels like loss. Marin noticed that Dove always went very quiet when Steve told these stories, and that afterward, when the meal was done, he would put his hand on his daughter's shoulder for a moment, just that, and something would move across his face that was too complex and too personal to look at directly. She looked away when it happened. It felt like the right thing to do. The men from Sublevel 6 found out on a Wednesday. She didn't know how. She found out afterward that one of them had a contact in the station's maintenance roster, someone who tracked unusual material rerouting in the supply logs, the kind of anomaly that appeared when supplies were being redirected from their logged destinations. It was a small thread. They pulled it. She found out because Steve came to the Tuesday service entrance, looking different than she had before. Not injured, just compressed, like something had been pressurized inside her and she was holding very still to keep it from showing. "They came last night," she said. Marin kept her voice even, hurt. "No, they didn't. My father heard them coming. We were in the new space already. They didn't know about it." She paused. "But they know someone is down there. They saw lights, and now they'll look." "How many are we talking about?" "4 usually, sometimes 6. The lower eyes moved. They don't work for the station. They just live here. They've been here a long time and they know the administrators look away from Sublevel 6 and so she stopped. "They will find us. It is only time." Marin thought for a moment. Then she thought for another moment. Then she stopped thinking about the version of herself that had rules about what she could and couldn't fix. "Do you trust me?" she said. Steve looked at her. "Yes." "Then I need to make some calls." She'd spent 3 years as a supply contractor for Whitmore Station. In that time, she'd built up a set of professional relationships with people in various parts of the station infrastructure. Not friendships, exactly, but the functional warmth of people who have depended on each other to get things done. The kind of relationships that included, in a few cases, people who worked in station security, in station administration, and in the office of the Compact World's Registrar's Regional Bureau, which was technically responsible for the documentation processing that the system had broken down in such a way as to make impossible for people exactly like Dove and Steve. She was not a person who called in favors easily. She had, in fact, been unconsciously saving these particular chips for years, in the vague way you save things without admitting to yourself that you're saving them because you don't yet know what they're for. She spent 3 days making calls. The Compact World's Registrar Bureau contact, a tired woman named Hayes who had been trying to work around system failures in documentation processing for longer than Marin had been a contractor, listened to the situation and said, "I can't fast-track anything. But there's a provisional status application that technically doesn't require source documentation if the applicant can demonstrate continuous presence on station for more than 10 months and can provide a skills assessment verification." He's a structural engineer. He redesigned their sublevel air handling system in 6 weeks with salvage materials. A pause. "Get me the skills assessment. I can do the rest." The station security contact, a large man named Petra who Marin had spent 3 years running supply deliveries for, listened to the situation about Sublevel 6 with the expression of someone hearing a thing he had technically known about for a long time and had been waiting for a reason to address. "There's a way this goes," he said, "officially." "I know." And there's a way it goes if I pull the sub-level 6 inspection forward by about 6 weeks and happen to run it at the same time as a second inspection, focused on unauthorized occupation of maintenance spaces. Which one of those happens to go better for the people living below the freight depots? Petra leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Funny thing about unauthorized occupation charges, he said. They require that the occupants had nowhere else to go and no other options. If someone happened to have a provisional status application in process at the time, that creates a complicating factor, legally speaking. How long do we have? I can give you 4 days, maybe 5. She went down to the freight sublevels that night. Dove was awake. She had the impression he didn't sleep much, that he'd stopped trusting sleep somewhere in the last 11 months. And Sieve was folded into the corner with her jacket pulled around her, not asleep but resting, her lower eyes half closed. Marin laid out what was happening as clearly as she could. The provisional status application, the skills assessment, the timeline. Dove listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he sat for a long moment in the space he had built with salvage materials and 5 weeks of quiet, precise work. "You've been doing this for 3 days, he said. "Yes." "Why didn't you tell us you were doing it?" "Because I didn't know if it would work. I didn't want to," she stopped. "I didn't want to give you something and then have it not be real." He was quiet for a moment. "The skills assessment," he said, "what does it require?" "Documented demonstration, evidence of a completed engineering project." She looked around the space. The independent airflow system, the insulated walls, the carefully managed power draw that didn't flag in the grid monitoring. "I think I know what we'd use." In the corner, Sieve's lower eyes had opened. She was watching them both, and her expression, all 4 eyes together, was something Marin hadn't seen on her face before, something that looked cautiously like the beginning of belief in a particular outcome. Dove looked at the walls he'd built. He ran the tips of his fingers along the nearest junction, a gesture that was almost tender. "All right," he said. The 4 days were not clean. The men from sub-level 6 came on the 3rd night. Marin was there. She'd been sleeping in the space for the last 2 nights on the basis that she was a licensed supply contractor with documented legitimate access to the area, and her presence made things legally complicated. It was a thin shield. She knew it was thin. There were 5 of them. They came down the service corridor with the confidence of people who had been doing things like this for long enough that nobody had ever stopped them. Their lights swept the space. They found the entrance to the freight annex. Marin was standing in the doorway. She said, "This is a restricted maintenance area. Do you have documented authorization for access?" The man in front stopped. He was looking at her, then past her into the space, where Dove was standing very still and Sieve was behind him, and he made an assessment. And what she saw move across his face was the settled, contemptuous certainty of someone who has always been the one with options. "Lady," he said, "whatever arrangement you think you have here is supported by Station Security, the Compact World's Registrar Provisional Status Bureau, and my supply contractor access authorization, copies of which have been filed with Station Administration in the last 72 hours, Marin said. She said it in the same tone she'd used buying noodles at the food court stall. Pleasant, unbothered. "So I'm going to ask again if you have authorization for access to this area, because if you don't, you are currently in a documented restricted space at a time when there's a sub-level 6 inspection moving through the lower maintenance corridors, and I think your time would be better spent being somewhere else." There was a long moment. The man looked at her, she looked back at him. She'd built the rule about not making problems she couldn't solve, and she'd lived inside it for years, and she had spent 3 days making calls and 4 nights in a freight annex with an alien family. She'd met 6 weeks ago over a container of noodles, and she was extremely, almost serenely tired of walls that existed primarily to keep her from having to feel things. He looked past her one more time. Then he looked at the corridor behind him, where, at the far end, the very distant sound of a security inspection team was audible. He left. They all left. Marin stood in the doorway for another 20 seconds after the last light disappeared. Then she let out a breath that had been in her chest for approximately 4 days. Behind her, Steve said, "You knew they would come." "I thought they probably would." "And you were going to," the girl stopped. "You were just going to stand there." "That's usually what you have to do," Marin said and turned around. "Stand there and say the true thing out loud. It's surprisingly effective." Dove was still in the center of the space. He was looking at her the way he had looked at the schematic the first morning, with the attention of someone who is assessing load-bearing capacity, understanding what something is actually capable of holding. "The application," he said, "if it's approved." "When it's approved." He absorbed the correction. "When it's approved, what happens then?" "Then you have documentation. Then you have access to station services." Then she stopped, because she didn't want to overpromise, and she was aware that what she was describing was not an ending but a beginning, and the beginning was small and hard and would require more of everything than tonight had required. "Then you have options, which you didn't before." He nodded slowly. Steve crossed the space in 3 steps and sat down on the floor next to Marin's supply pack, which was still in the corner where she dropped it. She pulled her jacket tighter. She looked up at Marin with all 4 eyes. "In Veth IV," she said, "there was a market near our house." Marin sat down on the floor beside her. "You mentioned it." "They sold preserved fruit. There's no word for it in standard." "My father always called it." She said a word in the subsonic language, and Marin felt it more than heard it, a low resonance in her sternum. "It means something like the sweetness you remember after something is gone, the taste that stays." Marin was quiet for a moment. "Is there anything like it here?" Steve considered. "There is a vendor on level 2. Section C. She sells something from a fermentation jar. I passed by it once." She paused. "It is not the same, but it has the staying." She was quiet. "I have not gone back because I did not have." She stopped. "The money," Marin said. "Yes." "We'll go," Marin said. "Thursday, the 3 of us." Steve looked at her. Her lower eyes were moving in that pattern again, the complicated one Marin had never fully learned to read. Her upper eyes were very still. "All right," she said, quietly, like someone accepting the possibility of a thing they'd stopped letting themselves want. The provisional status application was approved 11 days later. Marin was in the service corridor on a Tuesday morning when Hayes called with the confirmation, and she stood very still in the corridor for a moment with the phone against her ear, and listened to the practiced bureaucratic language of an approval notice. And then she said thank you, and ended the call, and went to the East Service entrance where Steve was waiting. She didn't say anything. She just handed over the printed confirmation slip. Steve read it. She read it again. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time, and Marin watched the sequence of things that moved through her face, all 4 eyes involved, and did not try to name any of them because they were hers. Then Steve folded the slip very carefully, the way you fold something you are going to keep, and put it in her jacket pocket. "I have to show my father," she said. "I know." He will not show much. He is not." She paused. "He is careful about showing things." "I know," Marin said. "That's fine." Steve looked at her. "Thank you," she said, and it landed differently than it had the first time in the food court with the container of noodles. That had been the thanks of someone surprised by an unexpected kindness. This was the thanks of someone who had decided, deliberately, after 11 months of reasons not to believe that something was real. Marin nodded. She kept her face steady and she didn't say "you're welcome," because welcome implied debt and she didn't want that, and she didn't say it's nothing because that would be dishonest. She said Thursday, Level 2, Section C7 in the morning. Steve almost smiled. She'd gotten better at it in 6 weeks from someone who had forgotten how. I'll tell him. They went on Thursday. The Level 2 vendor was a small woman with calloused hands who sold things from jars she brought in herself, fermented and preserved by methods she apparently had not fully disclosed to the station's vendor licensing office. She looked at the three of them when they walked up, Marin, Dove with his hollow face and watchful eyes, and the bearing of an architect who'd spent 11 months in maintenance sublevels. Steve with her oversized jacket and her 4 eyes and the provisional status confirmation in her pocket. And she looked at them for a moment, and then she reached under the counter and put 3 sample cups on the surface. Try it first, she said. You might not like it. Steve tried it. She went still, her lower eyes closed for a moment. It's not the same, she said. No, the vendor said. But it has, she paused. Yes. It stays. The vendor nodded, the nod of someone who understood what was being communicated and named a price that was fair. And Duff paid it with the quiet, careful manner of someone spending money he actually had, which was new, which was 11 days old, which was the precise age of a piece of paper in his daughter's pocket. They stood in the concourse of Level 2 and ate the preserved thing from the cups, and it tasted like something Marin didn't have a word for, sweet and complex, and with a long finish. And she thought about the word Steve had said in the subsonic language, the sweetness you remember after something is gone, and she thought that you could also read it the other way, as the sweetness that returns after you'd thought it was gone, and she didn't say this out loud, because it was the kind of thing that didn't need to be said. Duff ate his portion and looked at nothing in particular for a moment, and then he put his hand on Steve's shoulder, just for a moment, just that, and something moved across his face. Marin looked away. She looked at the concourse, at the ordinary morning movement of Whitmore Station Level 2, transit passengers and supply workers, and the particular mix of species she'd been moving through for 3 years. And she thought about how much of it she'd been looking at without seeing, and how much of seeing was just choosing to keep your eyes open past the point where it becomes uncomfortable. She had a delivery at 8. She had supplies to move. She had a day that looked, on its surface, exactly like every other day she'd spent on the station. She thought it would feel different. She thought the right word for it was probably not happiness, which was too simple, or relief, which was too narrow. It was something more structural than that, something load-bearing. She thought about Duff's hands on the junction walls, the way he'd run his fingers along the connections he'd built, and she thought maybe the word was something that didn't exist in standard either. The feeling after you've put the weight on something you built yourself and it holds. She finished her cup. She had a delivery at 8. She said, I'll see you Tuesday, and Steve said, Tuesday, and Dove said nothing, which was enough. And Marin walked back toward the service corridor with her crate and her schedule, and the ordinary texture of a day that was, in all the small specific ways that mattered, different from the one before it.